It's a great honor for me to be able to inaugurate the proceedings of this conference. This is a sign of the universal perspective of an organization which has begun essentially from a Christian background to ask a person who is a Muslim from across the waters and the lands east to share with you a number of issues which are crucial not only for Europe and America, not only for the Western world, but for the whole world at large. And that is the spiritual crisis of modern man, which has led us to such an impasse that even the question of the family, which was taken to be the most normal and natural unit of human society from the Stone Age onward, has now to be discussed, as if we were to discuss how to breathe the air or how to drink water. But the problem is so profound and so severe that even the most elemental aspects of human life, which have nourished us until now, have now to be re-examined. We cannot take anything for granted, because the type of man who rebelled against heaven some centuries back, the type of man whom I define as modern man, in contrast to the contemporary man, by man of course I mean man and woman, who live in this world but who have not rebelled against the fundamental principles of life. This type of man has now forced us into a situation in which what was once most normal, natural, and taken for granted has to be fought for and sought, like the fresh air which we used to breathe so easily, but now we have to fight for in order to survive. Let me say a word at the beginning that the destinies of the West and the Islamic world are intertwined in this as in every other question. For many a century, the Islamic world was the West's only other civilization, the only other which the West knew. And it was as a result of the interaction between the two that both civilizations grew. In a period when there is so much misunderstanding and enmity, I think nothing is more important than bear upon those points which in fact unite those in the West who have faith in God and the Muslims who live in fact in this faith. And especially when it comes to the question of the family, which itself is rooted in the question of the crisis of man vis-a-vis himself, vis-a-vis his society, vis-a-vis the world of nature, and of course most of all vis-a-vis God, the creator of all of these realms. Now, before modern times, before man put himself in a position in which everything was questioned, he lived in the certitude that there was a reality beyond the physical world which surrounded him. He lived for that reality. He spent all of his life in such a way that the material conditions of life around him did not really determine what he was going to do and how he was going to live his life. There was always a world beyond. And therefore, the passions of the soul were checked by the certitude of a greater world which surrounds this and which commences at the moment of death. This certitude having been lost, in a sense, the earth and all of the material things which we seek became for most human beings the only end, the only thing to be sought. And as a result of this, a crisis has come about where even two spouses have difficulty earning a living to be able to bring up a family. The crisis which now is sought to be solved on the social level is, however, much more profound than the external trimmings and the question of social engineering by which many seek to redeem the maladies which are too manifest not to be seen by all, either skeptic or believer alike. There is a very deep spiritual malaise, a crisis in the modern world, which manifests itself, first of all, in the sense of the loss of meaning. Meaning is lost. Meaning in the ultimate sense is lost. And meaning is ultimately God. God is meaning. To have lost God is to have lost meaning. And the loss of meaning is always intertwined with the loss of the sacred. The sense of the sacred, which normal human beings always carry within themselves, as if one were carrying a relic, an icon in the Christian context. Traditional man always felt that the sacred was with him. This sense of the sacred is lost. It is one of the parameters of the normal experience of human life, which unfortunately has disappeared in the experience, day-to-day experience of many people who live in the modern world. And with the loss of the sacred has come the loss of the unity of life, the unity of the various aspects of human existence, the unity which once related religion, family, society, science, philosophy, theology, art, all together. The unity in which, in fact, not only Islam, which is based on unity, but Christian civilization, when the whole of Western Europe was Christian, breathed in, morning in and evening out, during many, many centuries of its existence. Since that unity is now lost, all of the institutions which were based on a divine injunction and which related to the sacred have either fallen apart or have been segmented and separated. There are several institutions in society today which are not the inventions of the modern world. They were there before the rebellion of man against heaven. They were there from the tradition, the past, which is primarily Christian, of the West. First of all, of course, the church. The church is not an invention of the modern world. Secondly, certain forms of rule, such as that of kingship, which were not invented by the modern world, the monarchy. Thirdly, the institution of revelation, which is the foundation of the church itself and the harbinger of truth. And fourthly, the family. The family is now the modern invention. And like all of those other institutions, it therefore is in the middle of a battleground where it has to fight for its survival. In the earlier phases of the rebellion against tradition in the West, and later on in the rest of the world, in the East as well, the rebellion began essentially with an attack against the main institution, which was that of religion itself. The atheists and agnostics of the last 2-3 centuries never thought that the family was also one of the institutions to be targeted. But little did they realize that in fact the structure of the family is meaningless, theologically, religiously, and psychologically, unless there is an element that transcends the purely biological union between male and female and the social conveniences of living together as a unit. That bond gradually having loosened. Unfortunately, this last of the divinely ordained institution of society, which is the family, is now being threatened like all of the others, like the church, like monarchy, like the whole idea of revelation and all that descends from it. And as a result, we now have a crisis where the loss of this unity is causing the various aspects and domains of human life to have become segmented and separated. There is, first of all, now, for most human beings who face this crisis, a separation of man from God, from ultimate meaning, from that which would bestow a degree of absoluteness to certain human activities, which would allow human beings to bear through pain, sorrow, difficulty, and sacrifice with something beyond the immediate gratification of the senses or the passions and the psychological drive which human beings have. The result of this alienation from God, from His teachings, is the alienation from nature. Nature is God's creation. It is not ours. We have not created it. And by this nature, I mean not only the trees and the meadows and the sky and the earth. I also mean the nature within us, our body, our biological system, which in fact is not our own. We have not made it. And that is why in both Christianity and Islam, suicide is a very great sin. And why you have in, for example, the Divine Comedy of Dante, the example of those who take their own life being in the inferno. And in Islam, likewise, it is said that when a person takes his life or her life, he will remain in the worst infernal state until the moment of his natural death, when God willed him to die, would come about. So we have also a nature within ourselves, a nature which manifests itself not only in the way we eat, not only in the way we walk, but of course also in procreativity, how we propagate the species, and therefore the question of sexuality, the question of the family, the question of all that relates us in one way or another to the biological world around us. Nature has become desacralized. It has become a machine, unfortunately, as a result of the transformations which took place in the 16th and 17th century in the domain of science, and before that theologically and philosophically in the West. Therefore, the idea that there is something sacrosanct about nature ceased to be of any consequence, except the know-how for many centuries did not allow this mutilation of the sacred sense of nature to have any effect upon the microcosm, upon us as human beings. It was the factories, it was the womb of the earth, the mines that were reaped and plundered as they have been, and of course the whole complex of the crisis, ecological and otherwise, which has come about, was made possible through this. But the human body, precisely because of the lack of know-how, somehow remained untouched until really this century. And now the desacralization of nature has come to roost within the being of that very creature who has desacralized nature, namely man. And therefore the whole question of the loss of the sense of balance with nature has come to have now tremendous social and human consequences, not only because of the bad food we eat or the dirty air that we breathe, but also in the whole question of the manipulation of means of biological continuity of the race, which from, of course, a religious point of view was always sacred. Every religion considers sexuality to be sacred, whether it is denied or accepted, whether it is considered to be a necessary element for propagation of the race as in Christianity, or to be itself a sacrament as in Islam. In all religions, it is not like eating an apple. It has had to do with the sacred quality of life itself. As a result of the alienation from God and from nature, the alienation of man from society has become more and more prevalent. For a long time, modern man, although he hated the nature about him in the sense that he wanted to aggressively dominate it, nevertheless, society as a whole remained intact. But it's society that gradually now begins to fall apart. And with it, the family, which is the unit of society, and within the family, man and women, the founders of the family themselves. In fact, the loss of the sense of the sacred goes back most of all to us, to the individual human being. There's no possibility of solving the problems of the world, whether it be that of the family or of the ecological crisis, without coming back to ourselves. What has happened is that, in a sense, many people in the modern world have lost the sense of a center. Traditional man always had a center. His life was based on a center. No matter how that was expressed theologically, in what language, in the language of personal God, or an omnipotent being, or the center of consciousness, in different religions, there was one point in which all religions were united, namely the human being had a center from which he or she has always acted. Now the center has been lost. And with the center has been lost the origin. The two fundamental points of reference of our ancestors throughout the millennia in which they lived on the surface of the earth was in fact the 2 points of the origin and the center. We all had an origin. We knew where we came from, and therefore we had a sense of belonging, and we had a center. We knew what was the point from which in fact our actions emanated, and the point around which our personality in a sense found its anchor. Now, of course, these 2 points are lost. We do not know what our origin is, and we do not know what our center is. It is not accidental that the loss of our center has led to these incredible theories of human origin, which are really science fiction, but which parade around and have paraded for the last century as scientific fact, and in fact change every decade or so, and therefore in a sense destroy the authentic, immutable origin of the human being, which resides in the world of the spirit, and which had always been able to sustain mankind over the centuries and millennia of his existence on earth, precisely because he knew where he was coming from and where he was going. To regain the center, which is the goal really that must be sought, we must first of all be aware of the dimension of the crisis that abounds around us. We speak so much and have spoken so much over these years about solutions to acute problems, especially since the 1960s, the awareness of the ecological crisis and the fact that something has gone wrong in the relationship between man and nature has become central. Many steps have been taken, but of course we know fully well that nothing serious ultimately has been done, because the worldview which has made this possible has not changed. There are those who wish to in fact amend the way that modern man has destroyed his natural environment so as to live a bit longer on the surface of the earth in the forgetfulness of God. But of course God will not permit this, and therefore all of the agnostic and unspiritual ways of seeking a solution to the reestablishment of a correct relationship between man and nature, all ways which seek in fact to live sanely in a rational way as if man were not a spiritual being, of course falter and are not ever successful, because they leave out what is the most essential element. It is in fact impossible for man to have a harmonious relationship with nature, not only the world of nature out there, but also within ourselves, without a correct rapport with heaven, without a correct rapport with the spiritual principle of one's own being. There is within man a drive that is so powerful that only the spirit can in a sense harness it. We see it externally in the way that today so many people seek avidly material things, and that is in fact the immediate cause why the family is endangered. People want too much, and it's not economically feasible to have a large family, and even a small family is a pain if one wants this and that and this and that. But what is it that's going to prevent the soul from wanting so much? What is it that's going to stop this inner drive for things? Either it has to be external social legislation, which one day may come because of an economic crunch, economic depression, or it has to be something that comes from within the human being. The first is not going to be very easily possible because of the tremendous technological power that in fact resides in the hand of man. And it's only the second, namely the inward control of this energy of expansion, this desire to acquire, to accumulate, to satiate the needs of the soul that can in fact perhaps redress the balance. And where is that going to come from? Except from the spirit, except from the inner dimension, the heart, the center, which alone can control the passions, the tremendous energies and forces within the human soul. Today, the family is only the last victim of a large number of victims of man's unbridled passion. That is, the divorce in human society today of such proportions that we see is really the external result of the divorce that took place between this passionate soul and the spirit a long time ago. And it's that divorce which has resulted in an externalization of the human being, in which creating a situation in which the human being, male and female, seek the needs that the soul has so much outwardly as to make it impossible even to be with each other, even to satisfy a basic biological need of togetherness. And now, of course, to this is added the possibility of intrusion through modern technology into the very processes of creation of children, of babies, of delays, of changes, of abortion, of biological technology, and so forth and so on, which will be dealt with in later lectures and into which I will not go, all of which are horrendous, extremely terrifying to many people. But very few people bother to ask, how did we get here? Why did this happen? Why is it that we have become alienated from ourselves as biological beings? Why is it that the cows and the dogs and the buffaloes never became like this? Why is it that even the normal biological cycles of the rest of creation went on, and here we, who are supposed to be such special creatures, have fallen into such a state in which with our own hands we are threatening, in fact, the demographic destruction of certain parts of the human race. One part of the human race from the loss of children, and the other part of the human race from its reverse problems caused also by modern technology. All of these terrible problems, to put it mildly, come back in a sense to this question of the loss of center. In fact, it is impossible to re-establish this harmony with nature, which we as human beings always yearn for, and with it to re-establish the integrity of our own bodies, the integrity of our own souls, the integrity of the family and of society, which in fact is comprised of families, without a rediscovery of that center. In the Bible it says, with God all things are possible. And one might add that without Him nothing is possible. In this very difficult moment of human history, I hope that all people of faith, whether they be Christian or Muslim, Jew or Gentile, Hindu or Buddhist, from any part of the world, but especially Muslims and Christians who've had a common history as two cousins, will be able to pull together the resources and their spiritual heritage to be able to confront the problem, which can only be solved by recourse to that common heritage and return to that being who, despite the fact that we have forgotten Him, never forgets us, because He is both compassionate and merciful.